The F-35 is the most advanced fighter jet in the world. Its capabilities are so far ahead of any other aircraft that it is frequently referred to as the most lethal fighter ever made. And while the F-35 was designed, developed, and manufactured entirely within the United States, today you can find these fifth-generation models all across the globe. In fact, with the exception of Russia and China, the U.S. has managed to sell this incredibly powerful war machine to our closest allies and partners from Japan to Australia. But in recent months, a very different kind of story has been dominating the headlines. Stories about how the U.S. has used its position as the world's sole superpower to essentially force European nations into submission by threatening to cut off the supply of weapons, ammunition, and spare parts unless they fall into line. How does that work? You can ask. Well, let me explain. This is the first episode of a new series called Tech Takedown, where we take an in-depth look at some of the most important technologies in the world and how they can be used to gain an advantage over your rivals. Today, we will be examining how the United States may have built itself a backdoor into Europe's Air Force. Now, let's get started. By now, we have all seen the incredible capabilities of the F-35. And while there are certainly some advantages to purchasing American military equipment, from the high level of cooperation between the Pentagon and various defense contractors, to the interoperability between the U.S. and allied militaries, it comes with some serious drawbacks as well. For example, the F-35 is so technologically advanced that it relies on hundreds of thousands of lines of computer code to operate. In fact, it has roughly 8 million total lines of code and contains upwards of 9.5 terabytes of data. To put that into perspective, that's the equivalent of storing nearly 2 million pictures in terms of data volume. All that data needs to be stored somewhere, which means that the U.S. can easily insert itself into the system to ensure that its allies don't do anything they shouldn't. But how does that work exactly? What I just described is what is known as a kill switch or a backdoor, which allows another party to shut down certain functions of the jet, or even disable the plane altogether. And while the U.S. has denied such allegations and insists that no such functionality was ever included in any of its F-35 contracts, the possibility still remains. Take, for instance, the Joint Chiefs of Staff most recent estimate that the F-35 contains somewhere between 20 and 40% of all the foreign source code within the entire Defense Department as portfolio. Foreign source code refers to any software or firmware that was not written by an American citizen. And therein lies the problem. When a country like France or Germany buys American weapons, they gain access to advanced technologies, know-how, and expertise that they might not otherwise have had. But in doing so, they also become reliant on the United States for the continued maintenance and upgrading of those systems. If the relationship sours, then that could spell disaster for whichever side ends up on the wrong end of the proverbial stick. That is precisely what is happening right now in Europe, where years of declining trust in America have culminated in a full-blown political crisis. Leaders across Europe are beginning to realize the risks associated with allowing the U.S. to have such a big say in their defense apparatus. Many fear that the presence of a U.S. backdoor in the F-35 gives Washington the ability to remotely access sensitive information about how and when the aircraft is used, raising concerns that American authorities could potentially monitor flights in real time or even track the personal communications of European leaders. Others worry that the U.S. could use this backdoor to limit the range or altitude of the F-35s flown by European allies, prevent them from engaging certain targets, or even force them to land if necessary. But perhaps even more troubling is the reality that many European nations simply don't know whether or not such a backdoor exists in the first place. Despite repeated assurances from the U.S. government that no such thing exists, Europeans remain unconvinced. After all, this isn't the first time that American authorities have tried to insert themselves into the systems of European allies. During the Cold War, the U.S. bugged the embassies of several NATO countries, including West Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And as recently as 2013, Edward Snowden revealed that the NSA had been secretly monitoring European politicians, diplomats, and even heads of state. So when the U.S. says that there is no backdoor in the F-35, it is hard for Europeans to believe them. Even before Russia invaded Ukraine, European defense officials were beginning to express their concerns. In an article published by the Financial Times last year, officials from France, Germany, and the UK admitted that the insertion of a backdoor into the F-35 would represent a major breach of trust and could undermine efforts to integrate European and American defense industries. But since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, these fears have only grown stronger. For decades, the U.S. has enjoyed something known as unipolarity, meaning that it was the only global power capable of projecting force on a worldwide scale. But the rise of China and Russia has challenged that dominance and forced the U.S. to reevaluate its strategy. As a result, Washington has begun taking steps to protect its own interests, even if it means upsetting its allies in the process. We have seen this most recently in the ongoing battle over Taiwan, where the U.S. has refused to clarify whether or not it would defend the island militarily in the event of a Chinese attack, effectively giving Beijing the green light to do whatever it wants. But this same mentality is now starting to emerge in the realm of defense contracting as well. Up until now, the European defense industry has been largely dominated by American companies. In fact, according to one estimate, some 60% of all defense equipment purchased by NATO members comes from the U.S. That represents a huge opportunity for American businesses. But it also gives Washington a lot of leverage over its allies. If the U.S. ever decides to flex its muscles, then it can do so with very little risk of reprisal. After all, European nations rely on the U.S. for the continued maintenance and upgrade of their equipment, which means they are unlikely to risk angering Washington. But that may soon change as European leaders are now beginning to rethink their strategy. Last year, the European Union announced plans to invest heavily in developing new fighter jets and drones, made entirely in Europe. The goal is to create a European Sky G6, a sixth-generation fighter jet that can rival the F-35 in terms of capability. So, while the EU still relies heavily on American equipment, it is taking steps to reduce that dependence in the long term. In fact, some experts believe that the EU will eventually replace the F-35 with the Saab Gripen fighter jet, which is already in service with several European air forces. According to a report from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, the Gripen is a cost-effective alternative to the F-35 that would allow European nations to maintain a high level of interoperability while reducing their dependence on the U.S. The report notes that the Gripens could be modified to meet the specific requirements of each nation, while still allowing them to operate seamlessly alongside other European and American aircraft. But even if Europeans do decide to go all in on the Gripen, it's unlikely that they will ever figure out what exactly is inside the F-35. After all, the U.S. is extremely protective of its advanced technologies and has been known to go to great lengths to keep them secret. In fact, the Pentagon has classified some 70% of the F-35's design. including information about its engine, radar, and weapons systems. That means that European allies will never know exactly what they are getting when they purchase an F-35. And it also means that the U.S. could potentially use this knowledge to its advantage if things ever go south. Now, I want to be clear here. There is no evidence that the U.S. is planning to use the F-35 to spy on its allies or limit their ability to use the aircraft in a conflict. But the possibility remains, and that alone is enough to raise concerns. At the end of the day, the U.S. has found itself in a bit of a pickle. On one hand, it desperately wants to maintain good relations with its allies in Europe. After all, their support is crucial to the success of NATO and the continued stability of the continent. But at the same time, the U.S. is facing growing challenges from both China and Russia, two countries that are increasingly hostile towards the West. In order to protect its own interests, the U.S. is taking steps to safeguard its advanced technologies, and the F-35 is the crown jewel of American defense contractors. If the U.S. ever finds itself in a position where it needs to choose sides, it will do whatever it takes to protect the F-35. And unfortunately for European allies, they will be caught in the middle. Thank you for watching and see you next time.